In today's session, we will talk about semiotics of violence. What is violence? How do we define violence? Why should we talk about violence? Why is it important that we should focus on different representations of violence from a cultural studies perspective? The answer to these questions is very simple. We are living in an age of violence. We are witnessing different types of violence. Violence has become an integral part of our culture. There are books, stories, movies, novels, historical narratives, personal narratives that look at the different consequences of violence in the lives of individuals and in the lives of groups. So, this is the reason why it is extremely important that we develop a deep understanding of violence, the meanings of violence. So, what is the etymological origin of the word violence? The word violence can be traced back to a Latin word valere, which means infringement. One of the important scholars who have done significant research on violence is Manfred Steger. He has written a wonderful book titled Judging Violence, the Dispute Between Idealists and Realists. And in this book, he argues that violence comprises a range of meanings, including to force, to injure, to dishonor, and to violate. Another scholar who has done considerable work on violence is Ted Honrich. In his book After the Terror, he defines violence as the use of force that injures, damages, violates, or destroys people or things. Since many acts of violence involves violation of different types and kinds, the concept of violence can be understood in terms of violation as well. One of the most significant scholars in this area is Vittorio Baffucci. He has written a wonderful article, Two Concepts of Violence. In this article, he attempts to nuance the concept of violence by arguing that, I quote, while acts of physical force often entail some form of violations, there are times when a violation occurs without the need of any physical force, or alternatively, acts of physical force may take place without anything or anyone being violated. So, in the case of certain instances of violence, there might be no violation, and the case of certain instances of violence, sometimes no individual might get violated. So violence may be defined, very simple, straightforward definition of violence is the intentional use of force. When you act violently, you are using force intentionally. But there is a qualifier. You use violence in an illegitimate, harmful, unethical, and destructive manner. So an act becomes a violent act when it is illegitimate, when it is harmful, unethical, and destructive. Thomas Fox argued that a person uses physical violence. You can argue that that individual is using physical violence only when he or she deliberately acts in a way that blocks another person's exercise of his or her legitimate rights by physical means. So, this is very important. When a person acts violently, only when he acts deliberately with the intention of blocking another individual's legitimate rights. Violence is the intentional infliction of physical or psychological injury. Violence may be physical, it can be psychological as well. And violence may be targeted against one individual, it could be also targeted against a group of individuals. And then another way to conceptualize violence is to look at violence as the violation of rights in three different ways. It might be violence, may be violation of personal rights, it might be the violation of the right to ourselves, and it might be the violation of human rights. All these definitions that we have looked at so far may be conceptualized as the minimalist conceptions of violence because these definitions they are based on or they look at violence in terms of force or in terms of violence. And then there is a new framework, an alternative framework, a more layered framework known as comprehensive conceptions of violence. And these frameworks, these new models introduced by scholars like Johann Galtung, who is known as the father of peace studies, these new models can account for the different modalities and ramifications of violence. Galtung classified violence into direct violence, structural violence, and cultural violence. In his article, Violence, Peace and Peace Research, he distinguished between what he conceptualized as direct violence and structural violence. What is direct violence? It's easier to define direct violence because in the case of direct violence, there would be a person or a group of persons who act as instigators of violence or perpetrators of violence. Direct violence may involve the use of physical force or emotional force or psychological force with the intention to hurt or harm an individual or a group. For example, if you attack your friend, that is an example of direct violence. If a person abuses you verbally, that is an act of physical violence. If you are trolled online, and if those trolls are able to inflict emotional damage on you, that can also be qualified as direct violence. So, direct violence encompasses murder, rape, assault, or any action or any behavior intended to cause harm, injury, or suffering. Direct violence is easily identifiable because it is concrete and visible in nature. And what is structural violence? It is to be understood as very in a different manner because violence is an integral part of the structural mechanism. And this is an invisible form of violence and more dangerous than direct violence, and because its consequences may be more long lasting. It's an abstract structural violence, an abstract form of violence. It is caused by unequal political, social, and economic systems. It might manifest as invisible form of violence, such as systemic inequalities. For example, look at a town like New York. The budget of the New York City is bigger than the budget of many sovereign countries in Asia and Africa. Yet, there are hundreds and thousands of poor people who can't afford proper housing, who can't afford proper medical care. Why? There is enough money, there are facilities, yet some individuals suffer. This suffering of the individuals can be attributed to structural violence. Structural violence is invisible. It is caused by unequal political, economic, and social systems. Galtung argues that structural violence shows up as unequal power and consequently as unequal life chances. And he further nuanced his definition of violence by introducing a new concept, cultural violence, in 1990. What is cultural violence? Very easy to understand. It is those elements. Cultural violence refers to those elements and aspects of a culture that justify and legitimize both physical violence and structural violence. Why do certain individuals act violently? Why do certain groups act violently? Because their acts are justified and legitimized by certain elements within that culture. So, cultural violence is those aspects that normalize violence, that legitimize violence, that create an ecosystem conducive for acts of violence. Yet, cultural violence creates an ecosystem in which different forms of violence may look right, they look not wrong. So Galtung argues that cultural violence can be seen in culture, it can be seen in arts, it can be seen in language, and it can be seen in belief systems. So, in this presentation, I was trying to define violence. I was trying to look at different conceptualizations of violence. I was trying to look at the nuances of the concept of violence. My main argument can be summed up as these 3 points. One, only if you have developed a proper paradigm of violence, only if you are aware of the various definitions of violence, you will be able to identify acts of violence happening around you. Without a proper theoretical framework, without a proper understanding of violence, you might not be able to understand the modalities of violence in your everyday life. That is the reason why it is extremely important that as students of literature, as students of culture, we develop a broader framework that would help us to identify violence, to theorize violence, and perhaps to contest violence. As I made clear during this presentation, violence is sometimes invisible, or most acts of violence are invisible, they are abstract, they occur at the abstract structural level or cultural level. Only if we are able to identify the modalities of structural violence, only if we are able to contest these modalities of structural violence, we would be able to create alternative systems of power that minimizes the possibilities of violence. And as students of literature, it's extremely important that we foreground those texts, those poems, those stories, those political, social, and cultural narratives that normalize acts of violence, that create the impression that violence against certain communities, violence against certain individuals can be legitimized, it can be normalized. So, only when we are able to challenge, problematize, and even reject cultural violence, we would be able to create a society in which individuals could live peacefully. Now, I want all of you to look at these concepts from diverse vantage points and apply them to the text. Thank you.